Hi everyone. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about the book of Genesis and the ways in which it can be interpreted. Remember, we talked before about how the term hermeneutics, I use the term hermeneutics, and hermeneutics is the science and art of interpretation. You engage in it every time that you receive a text message from a friend, or you read an email, or you watch a commercial, or you see something on television, or anything, any message that requires any amount of interpretation at all, where you put that message, whether that's a text, a letter, a note, a commercial, a TV show, a billboard, a poster, anything that requires you to understand the context behind it, what the intent is, what the person is trying to convey, where you don't just sit there staring at the text or staring at the image of a piece of artwork, but you apply your mind to what is meant by that, by how that message is conveyed. What are they trying to say? What is the message that they are trying to give to you? What do they mean when they do that? So, and again, I say they use the term "save" like a text message because, for example, you could get a text message from two people. One, the text message simply says, "Are we cool?" And one is from a friend who is trying to schedule with you an event or an outing or something where you could go enjoy yourself. So, "Are we cool?" means, is the schedule set? To you, it means, is the schedule set? Are we ready to go? Are we agreed upon when we're going to meet? That same text message, "Are we cool?" from, say, a significant other, could be an attempt to try to determine whether or not there's been a resolution to a conflict. Is the fight over? Are we still seeing one another? Is the relationship back in good working order? So that same message, it's not enough to simply say, what does the text say? You also have to engage in the context, in who sent it, what's the background behind that message, and the timing of it, and who it's from, in order to try to get at what it means. So it's not enough to simply say, what does it say? You also have to ask yourself, what does it mean? And in that sense, you engage in some interpretation. And hermeneutics is the science and art of interpretation. Well, the Bible, as I said before, the Bible is not a single book. And I was reading as I read through the various different comments, engage in the discussion. I try not to insert myself in the discussion in the discussion forum because I don't want to stifle discussion. It's really not the place for a lecture. But as I read through the comments, I see that there are many people who are under the mistaken impression that the Bible is a single book and that it's simply just a single book that you can go and because you're able to pick up maybe a paperback copy at Barnes & Noble or some other bookstore, you're mistakenly under the impression that it is a single book. And because it was so cheap, maybe you paid $5.99 for a paperback version, the idea is that it's somehow a simple book because it costs less than, say, a volume of Harry Potter or some other favorite volume. There's all sorts of ways in which we read the Bible wrong, simply for a number of different reasons. We read it wrong because it's bound in a single volume, and that fools our mind into thinking that it's somehow a completely unified book with all the same genre, the same author, and lacks, therefore, much intricacy, or it's very uncomplicated. The other reason is that because it's so accessible, we tend to read it wrong because we assume it can be simplistically understood. We therefore bypass and ignore its diversity, its heritage, its antiquity, all of which is very supported by both archaeological and manuscript evidence. So the problem is that we read the Bible wrong by assuming it's a single book, by assuming that it is simplistically understood, and that it doesn't require any sort of educated faculty on our part in order to interpret the message. That's the problem. The other thing I noticed in the discussion, and again I want to speak to it now, is something that you really want to avoid like the plague if you intend to engage in any sort of thoughtful discussion about these type of topics in the future. And not just to avoid having a paper marked off on my part, but you also, if you want to engage in thoughtful discussion with others in the future about these topics, you really want to avoid, like the plague, the phrases like, "I believe," or what I think, or you might say in my opinion, but specifically the worst one is I believe. When someone starts a sentence with I believe X, Y, Z, you're already signaling that you're about to share something that has no credibility and that carries no weight at all. So it's important to understand, and some of the most frequent culprits, some of the most frequent violators are those who are raised in a faith tradition, whether it be Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or any of the other type of pseudo-Christian sects, sects, sects that have sprung up in the United States over the last 200 years. People, if someone's raised in that type of tradition, they typically use that phrase a lot. I believe the following. They may say, I believe that the Bible is full of stories, or I believe that the Bible is literally true, or I believe X, Y, Z. Or sometimes it's from someone who has no faith assertion. They're simply saying, I believe that the Bible is written by people and it's changed so much over time. Problem is that when you say that, you're already signaling that to be dismissible. You're already signaling in advance that people can tune you out. And I know that you don't want that to happen. So in the rest of this class, what you want to do is you want to avoid, like the plague, using the phrase, I believe. Instead, you want to say, the evidence that I'm citing demonstrates that. So you want to cite evidence of something that you're asserting. For example, if you want to assert that the meaning of a particular part of the Bible has changed significantly over time, you're going to have to demonstrate that. You want to demonstrate why the meaning has demonstrated over time. Or if you say, well, there's all sorts of different interpretations that can be taken for the Bible, you're going to have to demonstrate which part you mean and include in that explanation some of the different interpretations that have been advanced by scholarly research. Textual analysis is a rather complicated process, and typically it involves people learning the original languages of that text, Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic, placing it within its original historical context, and accounting for what is the likely message that was meant to be conveyed at the time that it was written. Whether by its own internal chronology, that book of the Bible is written in, say, the 13th or 14th century BC, or in the 1st century AD. But the point is that there's plenty of literature on why something could be interpreted a certain way, and what the hermeneutics that have been employed are to arrive at that interpretation. You're going to have to support your assertion. So I really want you to avoid, as much as you can, completely if you can, the phrase, I believe, while you're in this class, because it is signaling to the hearers that they can tune you out. And I don't want anyone to finish my class with that sort of handicap in cultural conversation. So, having said that, let's go back to the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. It's the first book of the Old Testament. The Protestant canon separates the Bible into Old Testament and New Testament. And the Old Testament is the books of Genesis through Malachi, and the New Testament is the book of Matthew through Revelation. And Matthew through Revelation, according to its internal chronology and Christian tradition, is that it's written in the first century, all written in the 1st century AD, and that the Old Testament, Genesis through Malachi, is all written over the course of about 1,000 years, from roughly the 1400s BC to about the 400s BC, over the course of 1,000 years. That's a significant amount of cultural change that took place over that time. But and with a lot of different literary genres and a lot of different literary disciplines and styles that came to bear along the way. Now, reason why that's so important is because if you're going to be discussing hermeneutics, if you're going to be engaging in the complicated and scholarly process of hermeneutics, of looking at a text as to what's in interpretation, what its most likely interpretation really is, you're going to have to engage those different tools, looking at archaeology, linguistic, manuscript analysis, original language, historic and cultural context. In the chronology of the books of the Old Testament, or also seen as Hebrew Bible in the Jewish tradition, the book of Genesis comes first. Now, it's important to understand that the book of Genesis is, according to Jewish tradition, but also Christian tradition, the first five books of the Old Testament Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. According to those traditions, the first 5 books were written by the character by the name of Moses. Now, if you've never seen, if you don't know who that is, you definitely need to get on Netflix and watch either the film, what was it, with Christian Bale? Gods in, oh goodness gracious, Christian Bale played Moses. The title of that movie escapes me right now. The classic, of course, is The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner. But there's been a number of different ways in which the story of the Exodus and Moses has been portrayed in film. Some of you may have even seen the DreamWorks animated film, The Prince of Egypt. Nevertheless, it is the crux myth. It is the chief myth of Judaism, of the Old Testament, and also one of the foundational myths of Christianity as well, because the Christianity also claims all the traditions of the Jewish Old Testament as its own. Well, of the Hebrew Bible as its own. According to its own internal myths, and according to claims from Judaism and Christianity, that Moses wrote, compiled, or edited, or was the primary redactor for these first 5 books of the Bible. But the origin story for Moses is in the book of Exodus, which is the 2nd book. So if supposedly Moses compiled all these books, the first 5 books of the Bible, but the origin story of Moses is actually Exodus, which is the 2nd book, what does that make the 1st book? He wasn't alive. Now, again, I acknowledge that there is scholarly dispute and even some debate as to whether or not there was a historic Moses. Right now, I'm just dealing with whether or not within the internal claims of these religions that hold these books to be sacred anyway, like Judaism and Christianity, assuming, just giving them their due and assuming that there is an historic Moses. Assuming there is a historic Moses and this person is responsible for the first 5 books of the Bible, then how did the book of Genesis come about if Moses was not alive to have written on things that he witnessed? How is those stories compiled? Was it oral tradition that he compiled and brought the book of Genesis? Were there sources that were available for him to use in order to create the book of Genesis? There's the various different interpretations of what comprises the book of Genesis, which is the beginning. That is subject of scholarly disagreement, particularly the first 11 chapters of Genesis that seem to be distinct as a literary flow, as a literary genre. They really seem distinct and set apart from the remaining chapters of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 through 11 is very fantastical, very mythological. A great deal of literary messiness is occurring there in terms of angels and demons and calamities and all these epic tales that take place there. And then about in chapter 11 and 12, you get into the story of Abraham, and it switches. The book of Genesis changes in its flow to a more historic telling. And that's when you get into the story of Abraham, Isaac, of Jacob, and even in the story of Joseph by the end of the book of Genesis, which is the segue into the book of Exodus. But those first 11 chapters of Genesis really seem to stand out as a distinct unit. And then, even less, you shrink that category a little bit further. There's even the first 3 to 5 chapters of the book of Genesis, which deal with the origin stories, whether of God forming the universe, forming the earth, forming the primordial couple, Adam and Eve, the first temptation that takes place with the talking serpent and the expulsion from the garden and the Garden of Eden, and it happens there. And all these fantastical stories. Well, again, what are those stories and what are they conveying? And how was it, if just going by the claims of the internal claims of Judaism and Christianity, that Moses compiled or assembled or put together these stories into the book of Genesis, what would have been the editorial decision to compile those stories and write them the way they did? Were they exact oral tradition from what was originally received? Is it a thematic or a strategic telling of original stories? Or are those stories compiled and redacted in a way to make a specific point? Is there a cultural or historical context in which those stories would come into, that were originally given, where they would have more potency then than we would understand now? The answer to that question is why I've uploaded a paper onto the course content page that was a paper that was presented at the Evangelical Theological Society many years ago by a Bible scholar, a Old Testament scholar with whom I'm acquainted, who was exploring the various different interpretations of the book of Genesis that seek to understand what was likely meant by the original author and what they were trying to convey. But these are when it was first being posited that perhaps we've had it wrong trying to interpret the book of Genesis as a literal document. Say, for example, how Ken Ham does, and the Institution for Creation Research. If we were to try to, this was early scholarship several years ago that was trying to ask if indeed we were trying to take our hermeneutics seriously and really appreciate the grammatical, historical, linguistic, original context for how a book is written, what the original language is, what's it seeking to convey, and what's the context in which it's transmitted, and really do our diligence to employ all our hermeneutic tools to appreciate what it likely was meant by the original author and the message they conveyed to an original audience. Some of this areas were to explore and expand what was meant by the book of Genesis, especially those early chapters. That really took us into fun new territory. And one of the things that came out was, if you have, let's say, for example, just taking the claims of Christianity and Judaism, that the Moses is responsible for the redaction and the assembling and the editing and compiling of these first 5 books of the book of the Bible. And Moses, the origin story of Moses is in the book of Exodus, in which supposedly these people all come out of Egypt. Would we not expect to find significant Egyptian influence for those early Genesis myths? If you were to see some sort of cross-cultural pollination from a literary standpoint, if we were to see literary evidence that some Egyptian influence was to be found in the early creation narratives of Genesis, would we not? How would that manifest? What would that look like? Because we know that in many cases in the ancient Near East, there was some cross-cultural pollination. You see evidence of Mesopotamian writings, then later in the post-exilic writings of the Old Testament. You see even Egyptian writings that are influenced even in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. So these cross-cultural exchanges occur all the time. I've uploaded a paper for you to look at, and it's actually 2 documents. It's the paper presented it for the Evangelical Theological Society, and also an appendix that is supplemental material to that, of Egyptian influence on the book of Genesis, on the creation of the book, origin stories of the book of Genesis. I want you to skim through it. It's rather technical in some ways, and maybe some aspects of those hermeneutical disciplines you may be new to, but I want you to take a look through it, because that, as well as other ways of looking at Genesis, help us understand, one, the complexity of the biblical literature, and why the matter is not whether or not there's a conflict between the Bible and modern science, but between some who have, in my opinion, in my view, based upon my own knowledge and study of this literature, they've irresponsibly sought to interpret the biblical literature too simplistically and failed to employ all the hermeneutical tools available to us, and as a result, arrived at an interpretation of Genesis which conflicts with modern science and has kept that divide going. I think the monkey trial video that you saw was a good example of this, but there's other ways in which we're perpetuate even today. But a more sophisticated and a better, more responsible hermeneutic actually makes that conflict disappear. So I'd like you to take a look at that article by Gordon Johnston that I've uploaded on the content. It's something that can come up later on in an essay exam. And I want that to inform the way you go forward into thinking about how one looks at these biblical books, their complexity, and to square them with the findings of modern science. Johnston's not the only one who has alternative views of looking at Genesis based upon its ancient Near Eastern context. authors like Peter Enns and John Walton, also other authors I've shared with. If I haven't already put the a supplemental bibliography up, I will. But there are other authors that also take a look at this literature within its ancient Near Eastern context and give you a better appreciation for the sophistication with which this literature should be approached. And as a result, can, with a better eye and a more diligent discipline, can cause this supposed conflict between the Bible and modern science to actually fall apart. So avoid saying things like "I believe" or "I think" when you can't support it. You're going to, the rest of this class, you're going to need to support your assertions, particularly as it comes to matters of, because you may or may not believe a thing, but you're entitled to your own beliefs, but you aren't entitled to make assertions about other things that for which you could otherwise have better knowledge. But instead and for that reason, I don't want you to remain in ignorance about things that you're going to be expected to converse on in your cultural conversations going forward. All right? That's all I want to share about right now. I'll continue to talk about this as we go.